The day started like any other. I had packed my bags, kissed my wife goodbye, and told my kids I'd be gone for a few days on a routine assignment. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another shift away from home. What I didn't expect was the chaos that would greet me upon my return.
Karen. Just the name made my blood boil.
She was my neighbor, or rather, she used to be, and she had a knack for sticking her nose where it didn't belong. I had always kept my distance, politely nodding in the driveway or offering a curt hello when necessary. But I should have known better than to underestimate her. I pulled into my driveway, expecting the familiar sight of my cars lined up in perfect order. The cherry red '69 Mustang, my midnight black Corvette, and the classic '57 Chevy that my grandfather had restored for me before he passed. Instead, nothing. The spaces where my prized vehicles usually rested were empty. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten something. Maybe my brother or one of my buddies had borrowed them. My phone buzzed. A text from a neighbor. "Hey, did you know Karen sold your cars?" I froze. The text blurred on the screen as the words sank in. Sold my cars? I stormed to Karen's house, heart pounding. I could see her sitting on the porch, sipping her coffee with that smug smile she always wore like armor. She didn't even stand up when I knocked. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice low but dangerous. "You sold my cars?" She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Oh, those old things? I just helped clean up. You were gone for days. They were just sitting there collecting dust. I took them to the junkyard." My hands clenched into fists. "The junkyard?" I said through gritted teeth. "Do you have any idea what those cars are worth?" She shrugged. "They were just old cars to me. You never really drive them anyway." I felt a cold rage rising. Years of work, money, and memories, gone in a casual shrug. But as a cop, I had learned to control my emotions. I took a deep breath and lowered my voice to a measured calm. "Karen, I need to know exactly where you took them." She hesitated, clearly realizing she had miscalculated.
I
don't remember the name of the junkyard. It was somewhere off the highway." I didn't waste another second. I turned and started my car, dialing my partner on the way. If Karen thought she could get away with this because I was out of town, she had another thing coming. I arrived at the junkyard in record time, flashing my badge before anyone could ask questions. The owners froze when they saw it. "You're a cop?" one of them stammered. We didn't know. Karen just dropped them off." I didn't need any more explanation. Walking past the piles of rusting metal, my eyes locked on the unmistakable lines of my Mustang, the Corvette's sleek curves, the Chevy's gleaming chrome. They were scratched and dented, but intact. "Who's responsible for this?" I asked, my voice cold. They pointed nervously toward a small office, and I could already guess. Later, back at home, I called Karen. She tried to play dumb again, but the jig was up. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but icy. "Do you have any idea who you just messed with?" Her laughter died in her throat when I added, "Because I'm not just a car collector. I'm a cop. And you just sold my evidence." The silence on the other end was deafening. I hung up, looking out at the empty driveway. My cars would be back, but Karen's mistake was irreversible. She didn't just cross a neighbor. She crossed a cop. And cops don't forget. This was just the beginning. Karen didn't answer her phone that night, and by the time I knocked on her door the next morning, I could already tell she knew trouble was coming. The neighborly facade she wore so well had crumbled overnight. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone or something to jump out at her. "Karen," I said, stepping onto her porch, keeping my tone calm but loaded with warning. "We need to talk." She swallowed hard, fumbling for words. I didn't think it was a big deal. They were just cars. "Just cars," I echoed, incredulous. "Those were collectibles, some of them older than most people around here. And you didn't just touch them. You sold them without asking. Do you have any idea what you just did?" Her shoulders slumped. I just wanted to make some extra cash. I didn't think a cop would come after you," I said, stepping closer. "You need to understand something, Karen. I don't just work as a cop. I protect what's mine, And I don't take shortcuts when someone crosses me. Her eyes widened as if the gravity of the situation finally hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. Words had failed her, and for once, that smug attitude of hers was gone. I didn't wait for her to recover. I pulled out my phone and began making calls. First, the junkyard. Then my partner. By the time I hung up, I had a full plan. Karen had underestimated me, and that would be her biggest mistake. By mid-morning, I had visited the junkyard again. This time, I wasn't just flashing a badge. I was taking inventory. The Mustang had a few scratches, the Corvette had a dented fender, but miraculously, the Chevy's chrome trim was untouched. Whoever had handled them had no idea what they were dealing with. I took photos, documented everything, and made notes for a formal report. Later, Karen appeared at the junkyard, cautiously approaching. "Please," she said, hands raised. I can pay for any damages. Just don't involve the cops." I shook my head. "Karen, you made your choice the moment you sold them. This isn't just about money. It's about accountability." Her face went pale as I added, "And you've just learned the hard way that not every neighbor is harmless. Some of us are trained to handle situations like this, and I am trained." She flinched, and I knew the panic had set in. Karen's mind was racing, thinking of ways to get out of this, but she had no escape. I let her stew for a moment, just long enough for her to realize she had no cards left to play. "I need to make sure this never happens again," I said, my voice low. "You don't touch my property, you don't interfere with my life, and if you ever try anything like this again, you'll be dealing with more than just me. You'll be dealing with the law." She nodded quickly, a tremor in her hands. I understand. I won't ever." I cut her off. "Good. Let's hope you mean that." As she scurried away, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My cars were safe, yes, but the bigger lesson had already been sent. Karen had crossed a line she shouldn't have, and I had made it clear that my world was not a playground for her schemes. Back at home, I stood in the driveway, staring at the empty spaces where my cars used to be. They would return soon enough, but this wasn't just about vehicles anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and consequences. Karen had learned that the hard way, and I had learned something too. Being a cop wasn't just about enforcing laws on the street. Sometimes it was about protecting your own life, your property, and your peace of mind. And for Karen, this would be a lesson she'd never forget. The next morning, Karen was nowhere to be seen. I knew she was lying low, probably plotting some half-baked excuse or scrambling to cover her tracks. But I wasn't about to let this go quietly. My cars had been sold to a junkyard while I was away, a bold, reckless move that required a serious investigation. I started by retracing her steps. Phone records, credit transactions, and calls to the junkyard were my first targets. Within an hour, I had a list of names, numbers, and timestamps. It was clear that Karen hadn't acted entirely alone. Someone had helped her, or at least facilitated her scheme. The thought made my blood boil. I drove to the first name on the list, a local tow truck driver. When he saw me pull up, his confident grin vanished. "Officer?" he stammered. "Yes," I said, showing my badge. "I need the truth. Did Karen call you to haul my cars?" His eyes flicked nervously to the back of his truck. Yeah, but I didn't know whose they were." She said she had permission. I didn't even flinch. Permission? Permission comes from the owner, not from someone with a vendetta. You just helped steal property. He swallowed hard. I didn't know she was lying. I swear. I just did what she asked." I took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer. "Good. That's all I need from you. But if you're lying now, it won't end well for you. Understand?" He nodded frantically, and I left, my mind racing. Karen had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost her. Back at home, I checked my messages. My partner had dug up additional evidence, emails between Karen and the junkyard, along with a text where she bragged about getting rid of the old cars. She hadn't even tried to hide her tracks. I smiled grimly. Some people just don't learn until it's too late. I decided it was time for a face-to-face confrontation. Karen's house was quiet when I arrived. I knocked firmly, then entered when no one answered. She was sitting in the living room, trying to act casual, but her nervous energy was palpable. "I see you've been busy," I said, holding up the phone with the evidence. Her eyes went wide. I didn't mean anything bad," she stammered. I shook my head. "That's not how it works. You don't just sell someone else's property because it's convenient for you. You don't think about the consequences. And now you're going to deal with them." She tried to protest, but I held up a hand. "No excuses. You've already involved other people, too. The tow driver, the junkyard, all of them are off the hook because they cooperated.
But you?
You made the choice. And as a cop, I don't take lightly when someone chooses to break the law, especially when it's right under my nose." Karen finally sank into the couch, defeated. She was no longer the smug, confident neighbor I had dealt with before. She was someone who had been caught red-handed, someone who realized she had pushed too far. I'll make it right," she whispered. I leaned in closer. "You better. Because I'm not just protecting my property, I'm sending a message. You don't mess with me, my family, or my life. Not ever. And if you think you can try something like this again, you'll regret it." For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. The kind of fear that comes from realizing she had underestimated someone with the power, training, and patience to make her pay. I left her house and took a deep breath in the driveway. My cars were on their way back, the evidence was solid, and Karen had learned a very important lesson. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I knew one thing for sure. This neighborhood, my property, and my peace of mind were safe.
For now.
I thought the situation with Karen was settling. My cars were safe, the junkyard had been cooperative, and the evidence against her was undeniable. But then came the subtle signs that she wasn't done. Small things at first. Rumors from neighbors, whispers of her plans to make things right in her own way. But as a cop, I knew better than to ignore a ticking time bomb. Karen's desperation was growing, and desperation could make people dangerous. That afternoon, I decided to check on my driveway. The Mustang gleamed in the sun, the Corvette looked flawless, and the Chevy's chromes sparkled like new. My family was around, enjoying the return of the cars, and I allowed myself a brief moment of relief. But that relief vanished when I noticed the mailbox. A thick envelope was slipped inside, no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in jagged handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside, note: "You think this is over? It's not. You've won this round, but don't think I'm finished.
K."
My jaw tightened. This wasn't just a neighborly grudge, it was a warning. Karen was escalating, and she clearly didn't realize who she was dealing with. I decided to confront her before her next move could cause real damage. I drove to her house, lights off, keeping a low profile. When I arrived, I saw movement inside through the blinds. She was pacing, clearly agitated, muttering to herself. I knocked firmly. "Karen," I said when she opened the door, my voice steady but cutting through the tension in the room. "We need to talk. Now." Her eyes widened at the sight of me. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. I stepped inside anyway. "Don't play games. I got your little message. It's clear you're planning something else. I'm giving you one last chance to stop before this gets worse for you." She laughed nervously, a sound that had lost all confidence.
"You don't understand.
I just wanted to teach you a lesson. That's all." I shook my head. "No, Karen. You wanted revenge, and now you're in over your head. You don't mess with someone trained to handle threats. You don't mess with a cop." Her face paled as I took a step closer. "Let's make this simple. You're going to tell me everything you've done, every plan you've had, and you're going to make it right. Otherwise," I let the words hang. She knew what otherwise meant. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her hands shook. I just wanted the money from selling the cars. I didn't mean to. You crossed a line," I interrupted firmly. "And now it's time to fix it. That's the only way this ends peacefully." She nodded slowly, finally understanding that her options were gone. Okay, I'll tell you everything, she whispered. By the end of the day, Karen had admitted to every step of her plan. The calls to the junkyard, the small bribes, even the initial intent to profit from my vehicles. I documented everything, made sure the junkyard and tow drivers were cleared, and filed the evidence. As I walked back to my driveway, my family waiting for me, I realized this chapter was finally over. My cars were back, my property secured, and Karen's lesson learned. Crossing a cop isn't a gamble anyone wins. I looked out at the driveway, the sun setting behind the restored vehicles. They gleamed like trophies, not just of classic engineering, but of patience, control, and the unshakable truth that some people underestimate at their own peril. And as for Karen, she wouldn't forget this day. Neither would anyone else who thought they could play fast and loose with someone who protects not just the law, but what's theirs. This was the neighborhood I controlled. This was the message sent. And for now, peace had returned. The morning after Karen's confession, the neighborhood felt different. There was a calmness in the air, almost like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But I wasn't done. This wasn't just about my cars or even about Karen. It was about making sure everyone understood the consequences of crossing someone who didn't take threats lightly. I started the day by securing the cars. Each one was carefully checked for damage, cleaned, and parked in a place where they could no longer be touched by anyone else. The Mustang's paint gleamed, the Corvette's sleek curves reflected the sunlight perfectly, and the Chevy's chrome looked better than ever. These weren't just vehicles. They were symbols of patience, discipline, and control. Next, I made a few calls. Karen's actions had to have consequences, but I wanted them to be fair and educational, not purely punitive. I contacted a local mediator and suggested she attend a community restitution program. She needed to understand the impact of her actions, not just pay back money. I also made sure the junkyard and tow drivers were fully cleared. They'd cooperated and weren't part of the reckless plan. By mid-afternoon, I decided to confront Karen one last time. She answered the door hesitantly, her eyes wide, hands wringing nervously. I've paid the money back, and I've signed up for the program, she said quickly. Good, I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. Actions matter, Karen. Words don't. You've already learned that crossing me was a huge mistake. Now it's time to follow through and show that lesson actually means something. She nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. I get it. I won't do anything like this again. I didn't smile. There was no need. She had seen enough already. See that you don't. And remember, this neighborhood isn't a place for shortcuts or schemes. It's a place where respect and accountability matters. Later, I walked back to my driveway, letting the warm sunlight wash over the restored vehicles. I watched my kids play nearby, their laughter filling the air. The Mustang, the Corvette, and the Chevy weren't just restored. They were protected. And the neighborhood, for now, was at peace. But more than that, I felt the satisfaction of knowing a lesson had been sent. Karen would think twice before ever interfering in someone else's life again. And anyone else who might consider doing the same would see that crossing a cop, and someone who values their property, is a gamble they cannot win. By evening, the neighborhood returned to normal. The subtle tension had eased, replaced by an unspoken respect. People glanced at my driveway, perhaps remembering the chaos that had unfolded, but also noticing the control, patience, and authority that had resolved it all. As I sat on the porch that night, watching the sunset paint the sky in orange and red, I reflected on the entire ordeal. It wasn't just about reclaiming my cars or confronting Karen. It was about asserting boundaries, reinforcing respect, and showing that actions always carry consequences. The neighborhood had learned a lesson, but more importantly, I had shown that I could handle threats not with brute force alone, but with strategy, patience, and clear authority. Karen's chapter in this story was over, and my world was back in order. The cars gleamed in the fading light, a quiet reminder that some things are worth protecting fiercely, and some people are better off thinking twice before they try to cross the wrong person. For me, life could finally return to normal. My family, my home, my cars, and my peace of mind were intact. And in the neighborhood, one clear message remained. Respect isn't optional, and mistakes can be costly when you're dealing with someone trained to enforce boundaries. The week after Karen's confession felt unusually quiet. The neighborhood was calm, almost unnervingly so, as if everyone was aware that the events of the past days had shifted the balance. I noticed it in the way neighbors kept a careful distance, in the cautious glances Karen gave from behind her blinds, and even in the subtle nods of acknowledgement when we crossed paths. Karen had kept her word, mostly. She had signed up for the restitution program, paid for the damages, and avoided any further attempts to manipulate or provoke. But I could sense the tension in her actions, the way she moved around her own house like she was walking on thin ice. It was a mixture of fear, regret, and, let's be honest, embarrassment. I hadn't intended to gloat, but being a cop wasn't just a job, it was a mindset. And part of that mindset was understanding human behavior. People like Karen always make mistakes. They overestimate themselves, underestimate the consequences, and assume that charm or audacity will carry them through. But the truth always catches up. That afternoon, I drove by her house on a routine check, not because I needed to spy, but to ensure that the situation stayed under control. I saw her in the yard, attempting to tidy up the landscaping. Her movements were sharp and calculated, unlike her usual careless energy. I parked a short distance away and watched quietly. There was a lesson being absorbed here, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. Later, I ran into a neighbor while walking my dog. "Have you noticed Karen's changed?" they asked, nodding toward her house. "She's quieter, more careful." I smiled faintly. That's one way to put it. Sometimes people need a wake-up call to see things clearly. She's getting hers. The reality was, Karen's ordeal wasn't just about the cars. It was about accountability. My cars had been restored, yes, but the true victory was the message being sent, clearly, silently, yet unmistakably. This neighborhood, my home, and my property were not playgrounds for reckless schemes. And anyone who thought otherwise would now think twice. By the weekend, I decided to host a small family gathering in the driveway. The Mustang, Corvette, and Chevy stood proudly as my kids ran around, laughing and playing. For me, these cars represented more than nostalgia. They were a symbol of resilience and control, a reminder that when chaos struck, calm and strategy would always win. Karen's presence wasn't invited, and she stayed away. I knew she would, and that was just fine. Sometimes lessons are best learned from a distance. As the sun set, painting the sky in deep reds and oranges, I stood beside my family, looking out at the restored vehicles and the calm neighborhood. Everything was back in order, but the memory of what had happened lingered, not as a threat, but as a quiet reinforcement of boundaries, respect, and consequences. I knew Karen would never forget this week. The fear and realization of her own mistakes would stay with her, shaping her future choices. And in a neighborhood where people often think they can push limits, that subtle reminder was invaluable. For me, it was closure. The chaos caused by one reckless neighbor had been contained, the property restored, and respect reestablished. Life could continue, but the lesson would echo for a long time, quiet, clear, and unforgettable. As I watched the stars begin to twinkle above, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The Mustang's chrome gleamed, the Corvette reflected the fading light, and the Chevy stood proud. All was calm, all was right. And Karen, somewhere behind her blinds, would remember exactly what it meant to cross a cop. Sometimes, the loudest lessons aren't shouted, they're lived. It had been 2 weeks since Karen's confession and the restitution program began. The neighborhood had returned to an uneasy calm, the kind that comes after a storm when everyone knows the storm's power firsthand. I thought the chapter was closed, but something in Karen's behavior hinted otherwise. I noticed it first when I saw her lingering near my driveway one evening, pretending to water plants, but glancing at me and my cars too often. Her eyes carried the same frantic energy I'd seen the day she sold my vehicles, a mix of fear, calculation, and desperation. I decided to let her stew a little, letting her realize that her actions had consequences and that she couldn't manipulate the situation anymore. Later that night, As I checked the security cameras I had installed around the property, I caught her moving suspiciously near the Corvette. My heart rate quickened, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. I knew she wouldn't try something reckless without thinking it through, but her desperation could make her careless. I grabbed my jacket and quietly went outside. The streetlights cast long shadows, and I approached slowly, my badge visible, but not waving it around. Karen froze when she saw me, the water hose in her hand dangling like a forgotten prop. "You're still here," I said calmly. "Trying something?" She swallowed hard, stepping back. I'm making sure everything's fine," she stammered. I didn't flinch. "Karen, look at me. This ends now. You don't touch my property, you don't interfere in my life, and you don't think for 1 second that you can manipulate or intimidate me." Her face went pale, and I could see the realization hitting her. She had pushed one last time, and now there was no safety net. "You've had 2 chances," I continued, my voice low but sharp. 2 chances to learn respect, accountability, and boundaries. And yet here you are, thinking maybe you can test them one more time. Let me make this clear. The next time, there will be legal consequences. Not warnings. Not lectures. Legal consequences. Understand? Tears welled up in her eyes.
I understand.
I won't ever. I held up my hand. Good. That's all I needed to hear. Consider this your final warning. As I turned to walk back to my driveway, she sank to the curb, realizing that her window of opportunity was gone. For the first time, I saw genuine fear and humility, not the false bravado or smug arrogance she had worn before. She had been completely outmatched, and she knew it. Back at home, I checked the driveway one last time that night. The Mustang, Corvette, and Chevy gleamed under the porch lights. Each vehicle represented more than nostalgia or a hobby. They were symbols of patience, strategy, and the consequences of crossing someone who was trained, alert, and uncompromising. The neighborhood, too, had learned something. The story of Karen's miscalculation spread quietly among the neighbors, reinforcing an unspoken truth. Boundaries exist for a reason, and some lines are never to be crossed. As I stood there, my family safe inside, I felt a deep sense of closure. The chaos had passed, lessons had been learned, and the neighborhood had returned to balance. My property was secure, my authority respected, and Karen, well, she would remember this night for the rest of her life. Sometimes, people only learn through experience. And in this case, Karen had learned in the most effective way possible, the hard way. The stars shone above, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood filled the night. My cars sparkled in the porch light, untouched, untouchable. The lesson had been delivered, and peace had finally returned. Some victories are quiet. Some messages are subtle. But in the end, respect is earned, and anyone foolish enough to test it quickly learns who holds the upper hand. And in this neighborhood, that was crystal clear.